Good morning. It's Mark Anthony here at Demolition News. No intention of going live today, no plans whatsoever, but obviously been overtaken by events. I finished a live stream last night and retired to bed mentally drained, even though I'm never physically drained because I spend most of my day sat down. And my wife, just as I was nodding off to sleep, mentioned the fact that there'd been some sort of incident in Ohio. I was only vaguely aware of what she was saying because I was so knackered by that point. But I've woken this morning to the news, and I'm doing this as I'm going along. So bear with me. Apparently, there's one person in hospital and at least 3 unaccounted for after a power plant in Ohio collapsed while workers were inside. Apparently, it's in Adams County. It's the Killen generating station. Now, obviously, for those of us that are in the demolition business, and particularly those in the UK, that will have immediate echoes of what happened back in 2016 at Didcot. And I think the parallels between the two run deeper than the fact that this was just a power station collapse. First of all, obviously there is the fact that it's a power station, and that was precisely what happened with Didcot. Coal-fired power station being taken down to comply with EU regulations on emissions. But then there's also the numbers. According to, I think I'm looking at Fox News at the moment, which is not really my normal choice of news outlet. But looking at this now, it looks as if there's 3 unaccounted for and 1 in hospital. That kind of mirrors the sort of numbers we were looking at back at Didcot. We tend to look back and think of Didcot as the Didcot 4, and certainly 4 men were killed on that day. But if you remember rightly, one of those guys, Mick Collins, was actually recovered almost immediately and declared deceased in very short order. But we had a prolonged period in which the other 3 were unaccounted for. The other 3 obviously being Ken Cresswell, John Shaw, and Chris Huxtable. And I'm reminded, as I often am with these accidents and these incidents, of the way that the news unfolded. I got a phone call after Didcot. I guess it must have been about 8 o'clock at night. And I was asked by Sky News to be on site for, I think it was 6 o'clock the following morning. So it was probably the best part of 12, maybe 14 hours after the incident happened. And at that time, they were using terms like unaccounted for. Now, I'd been to Didcot probably 3 or 4 times previously to that, and Didcot has got it's got a train station, it's obviously got a power station, but there's not really a great deal else there. And there was initially some thought that maybe the 3 men that were unaccounted for had perhaps left the site for some inexplicable reason, and that they would turn up alive and well, and apologetic for having disappeared for a few hours when chaos ensued. But as I say, having been to Didcot, there would be no reason for them to do that. There's a McDonald's restaurant about 1.5 miles, maybe 2 miles up the road. But there's not much else. And it was a cold February day, and there was, I guess, the hope that they may have just taken it upon themselves to go and grab themselves a cup of coffee somewhere and get warm. But as I say, having been to Didcot, that was never likely to be the case. For one thing, there was on-site facilities, so they had no real need to leave the site on the day. And also, this being a power station, getting in and out, it was an absolute nightmare. As I say, I did it 3 or 4 times, I guess. And each time, not only do you have to go through a fairly rigorous sign-in procedure, you had to then be accompanied from the gatehouse to the office of the demolition company involved, which was only 200 yards away. I mean, you could see one from the other, but you still had to be accompanied. So, again, going back to Ohio, this speculation that people are unaccounted for and clinging to the hope that they will be found safe and well. Jason, yeah, I certainly echo what you're saying there. I certainly hope they are found safe and sound very quickly. Looking back with the Didcot experience, when I first arrived on site, there was a lot of talk among the assembled press that maybe, if they weren't unaccounted for in that they'd left the site, was that there may have been some sort of basement structure beneath the collapsed boiler house, and maybe the three guys that were still missing had been working in there. And maybe they'd been protected from the collapse when it happened. I think everybody underestimated the sheer force of maybe 15 or 20,000 tons of steel coming down, and what that could have done to a basement structure. But I think at that point everybody was just clinging to hope, probably much as they are doing in Ohio as we speak. But there was nagging away in the back of my brain was the fact that it was bitterly cold. It obviously Didcot happened in February, and it was bitterly cold. So anybody that laid undiscovered would have been in a pretty poor state, even just through the weather. And I could sense I was as I say, I was there from maybe 5:50 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And as the day progressed, you could feel, you could actually feel the hope starting to ebb away. A lot of the questions that I faced when I first arrived, and then a lot of the speculation among both the press and the local people, just started to dissipate. There were ambulances coming and going. I'm not entirely sure to this day what they were doing, because obviously it'll be quite some time before the three unaccounted for men were finally recovered. But it was probably around about lunchtime, I guess, that people started to talk about what had initially been a rescue mission, and it was starting to become a recovery mission. I think it was probably several more days before anybody publicly admitted that, but that sense was tangible on the day after Didcot. And again, it feels like such a strange thing to be talking about something that happened almost 5 years ago, in comparison to something that happened just a few hours ago. But I know from having gone through the Didcot experience, news is not forthcoming. There's an awful lot of speculation. One of the things that annoys me to this very day was the number of people that took it upon themselves to turn up and mingle with the press in the immediate aftermath of Didcot, and attempt to pass themselves off as some kind of engineering expert. There were local people that swore blind they'd predicted the collapse and that they'd seen it coming. They apparently had some inside track on what had caused the accident, and had therefore decided that this was going to happen, and they were delighted with their 15 minutes in the spotlight when it did happen, because it got them on the telly. We also had politicians jumping on the bandwagon as well, talking about how Demolition needed to get its act together, and so on down the line. But one of the things that stuck with me from all of that was the fact that there was just a huge amount of silence, despite the fact that the press, and it wasn't just UK press, it was local press, it was regional press, national press, and even international press on the day after Didcot happened, and there were hundreds of local people there as well, and we were basically talking amongst ourselves because nobody knew anything. We knew obviously that part of the boiler house had collapsed. We knew that there were men unaccounted for, but we didn't know who they were. We didn't know where they were. We didn't know their names, where they might have been working when it happened, and all of it just descended into just speculation. Just people trying to fill airtime with speculation, and it certainly gave me an insight into how the rolling news media works. As I said earlier, I was invited to attend by Sky News, which I did. I probably spent about an hour on and off, maybe a little bit longer, with Sky News, going live to air several times during that time. But over in the background, there were several more camera crews, and literally as I was coming off air, somebody would come over and say, we're from ITV. Who are you? Oh, well, I'm Mark Anthony. I'm from Demolition News. Or could you come on our channel as well? So I did ITV as well. And then that one would come to an end, and then somebody else would come over. Oh, well, we're from Channel 4 News, or we're from the BBC, or we're from Radio Oxford, or whatever it might be. And again, it was just to fill airtime. Nobody knew anything. I know nothing to this day. I know nothing. All I could bring to the party was the fact that I knew the company involved. I'd been on the site several times before, but I had no idea what had caused it. I had no idea about the location of the three men that were unaccounted for and feared perished. But the media just needs to fill airspace, and I fear that will probably, well, almost certainly be the case in the US, the country that originated the rolling news media. So the families of the three men, the three unaccounted for men in Ohio, will now be looking at days and possibly weeks of speculation and theory based on nothing, but often about the whereabouts and the likely outcome of a collapse at another power station. I think one of the reasons that I've decided to come on live today as well is I don't suppose for one moment that anyone in Ohio is watching. It's probably early hours of the morning over there now, and they've frankly got better things to do. But we've learned no lessons over here from the Didcot disaster. It'll be the fifth anniversary of Didcot in just a few months. We're no nearer now finding out what actually caused that collapse. There have been no prosecutions, no presented findings, no public inquiries, nothing like that. So we're still very much in the dark, and worst of all is the fact that the four families of the guys that were killed at Didcot are still waiting for some sort of closure, some sort of explanation as to why their loved ones didn't return home that day. I'll come back to that in a second, but one of the things that I think makes Didcot as memorable and unforgettable and momentous as it was the fact that there was this sudden outpouring of concern and everybody within the UK demolition industry and further afield turning their attention to Didcot. And yet it would be another 6 months before the bodies of the three missing men were recovered and returned to their families. I can only imagine how painful that 6 months must have been for those families. The not knowing, the constant waiting by the telephone for the dreaded phone call that confirms what you already know. After 6 months, I think we'd all accepted the fact that those three men had tragically perished through no fault of their own. But that constant waiting for a phone call must have been like torture. And yet here we are. We're almost 5 years down the line, and there are now another three families on the other side of the Atlantic that are likely to go through precisely the same process. I can only hope that the American authorities act more swiftly and more decisively than those in the UK have and continue to do. It became very clear early on, literally within hours of the Didcot disaster happening, that a key concern was a possible future prosecution, literally with dust still in the air at Didcot. The site was sealed off and declared a crime scene, and an investigation ensued, and the health and safety executive basically took control of the site. Was that the right thing to do? Yes, it probably was. There was still a large part of the power station boiler house standing and declared unstable. So yeah, they were possibly or probably right to take control, but that then clouded the way that the investigation progressed, and that rather than as I took a lot of phone calls over the days that followed Didcot from fellow demolition men and women. A lot of them were volunteering to get down to Didcot, to get behind the levers of a digger and to move the tangled mess of 15 or 20,000 tons of steel to rescue or recover or to find the men that were still missing. The health and safety executive decided that was not the case. They instead decided that the best approach was a meticulous and forensic examination of all of that steel, even though that meant that 3 men were unrecovered for just an incredible amount of time. I mean, we are talking about a power station in the UK. We're not talking about a rescue mission to the moon or the seabed. You know, these were men that were reachable and should have been recovered in far shorter order, but they weren't. They weren't, and it, as I say, it would be another 6+ months before they were. And with each passing day, the sadness and the wear on those 3 families must have just been unbearable. And yet here we are. You know, we are 5 years down the line almost, and we're going to go through the same process again. As I said earlier, I can only hope that the American authorities act more swiftly and decisively. And if we are sadly talking about a recovery rather than a rescue mission, I hope that they can perform that in short order, and give some, I can't even think of the word. Comfort, is comfort a word in that context? But to give something back to the families and say, you know, this is what's happened. We can confirm that your loved one will not be coming home. It is unquestionably the worst news that a family member can possibly receive, but it's got to be better than that constant waiting for a phone call that seems to never come and then finally does 6 months later. I also want to touch on the fact that this is it's another power station. I've been quite vocal about the fact that we've had no findings yet from Didcot. I understand. I do understand. I have been critical of the HSE in the past, and probably will be again in the future. But Didcot was always about more than Didcot. The very reason that Didcot and the power stations at Longannet and Grain and various others in the UK have been demolished or decommissioned and subsequently demolished was part of an EU directive to take offline and demolish coal-fired power stations that were belching noxious emissions into the Earth's atmosphere. Now, as I say, that was an EU directive. So here in Europe, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of power stations that were facing a similar fate to Didcot. Certainly, the speculation and the phone calls that we received initially came from the likes of Germany and France and Spain and Italy as other demolition contractors who were potentially facing the demolition of something very similar to Didcot, were looking for some possible feedback, for some possible advice, for some sort of indication that maybe the health and safety executive had found some fundamental weakness or flaw in the design of a coal-fired power station. Now, as I say, that was an EU directive that didn't necessarily apply elsewhere, but the world the world has simultaneously recognised the threat to the environment from fossil fuels and from coal-fired power stations. So although that was an EU directive, those power stations have also been coming down as far afield as Australia, New Zealand, and obviously America. And I know America has been somewhat tardy in signing up to emissions regulations and emissions initiatives, but they're in the same boat. They too are facing the demise of coal-fired and fossil fuel power stations, and it now appears that part of the legacy of those fossil fuel power stations is not just the problems that the emissions themselves cause, but it's potentially the death of people that are charged with taking those power stations down and decommissioning and dismantling them. Could we have learned anything from Didcot? As I say, it's early days. I'm literally watching a news ticker going past on my screen as I'm talking to you. I don't know the first thing about the power station in Ohio. I'm sure that will become clear over the following days as I dig a little bit deeper and as news starts to emerge. But there've got to be parallels, and there is a nagging thought in my head, and it's something I've heard before, but it seems even more apt today. There is a nagging thought in my head that somewhere in a laboratory or an investigation unit in Buxton in Derbyshire, which apparently is where the Didcot investigation is taking place, there could be locked within all of that tangled steel an unspoken secret that might potentially have saved the lives of 3 people in Ohio and could still potentially save the lives of others in other power station decommissioning and demolition projects in another part of the world, or possibly even here in the UK. I hope that's not the case. I hope that when the HSE do finally present their findings and a potential and probable prosecution takes place, I hope it's proven that something else caused that collapse, and that even if the HSE had responded immediately, within hours, and given their findings within hours, that it wouldn't have had any influence on the project over in Ohio. But as it stands today, we just don't know. There remains a very real possibility that there could be some fundamental flaw in the design of a power station, that some kind of smoking gun that the HSE is sitting on for nearly 5 years later, and has, for one reason or another, chosen not to air. I think one of the things that I keep saying, one of the things, there's so many things that play on my mind with Didcot and what happened in its aftermath. But to make a future prosecution the focus of your investigation misses the point, and misses the point by a very, very wide margin. First and foremost, when Didcot happened, there were 3 extended families that didn't know what had happened to their loved ones, that couldn't bury their loved ones, that couldn't get on with their lives with any kind of closure. Excuse me, I need to take a tablet, bear with me. Blood pressure, sorry. Yeah, there were 3 families that couldn't move on with their lives, and I know that one of the guys, his daughter has since got married. Her father couldn't be at at the wedding, and she is now faced with having to get on with her life without the man that should have walked her down the aisle. And literally from day one, the focus just seemed to be on an eventual prosecution rather than restoring the remains of the four, or the three men actually, restoring the three men to their families, to the bosom of their families, and allowing them to be buried, and to give those families some closure. That the fact that they were denied that, and denied it for such a long time, I mean 6 months. My father's, I've mentioned this before, so it's no great secret. My father's not well at the moment. He's got numerous things wrong with him, and one of those is he has cancer, and he's not even 80 yet. So by modern standards, he's not an old guy. But I am now at the point where if my phone rings and it displays either my mother's name or my sister's name, the first thing that goes through my head is the fact that this is the call that I've been dreading. He's not even in hospital at the moment. He's on oxygen, and he has his highs and lows. But I am living day to day and hour to hour with the thought that I could get that phone call. Those people, those families of the three men that initially were unaccounted for at Didcot, lived with that for 6 or more months. Every time the phone rang, they must have just been filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. And we now have another 3 families of working men, the other side of the Atlantic, who are now facing that same prospect, that same dread of a phone call, to tell them what I'm sure they already fear, but to confirm that their worst fears have been realised. I'm not even sure why I'm live at the moment. I've not even written about the fact that the Ohio collapse has happened yet. I sat down to start, and Didcot just came rushing back. And I think it's important to point out that all I am is a journalist. I had no emotional connection to any of the 4 men. As far as I'm aware, I never met the 4 men that died at Didcot. I may have done, because as I say, I went there several times, but I was escorted around on each occasion. Met quite a few guys, but only to say hello to, so didn't really do formal introductions. So but as I say, I had no emotional connection, no sentimental connection to the 4 men that died there. When I was visiting as a journalist, I was there as a journalist. I wasn't there to become part of the Didcot family. I was just a passing guest, and I'm sure the Didcot Power Station project probably had a fair few passing guests over the months that it was taking place. But yeah, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is I have no reason for Didcot to have left the scar that it did on me, and yet it did. It really did. I still get on a regular basis. On a regular basis, that's probably overstating the point. But with the approach of each anniversary of the Didcot disaster, I tend to get phone calls from. It started out as TV news stations, but they apparently have moved on. I now get phone calls from the local press and from local radio, and those phone calls. I actually wrote about this about a year ago, almost a year ago, and those phone calls always start the same. You get a researcher saying, "Hi, Mark. Are you aware that this weekend marks the 4th or the 5th anniversary of the Didcot disaster?" Am I aware? I can tell you now, it will soon be 260 weeks since that disaster happened. Um, it would be wrong to say that I think about it every day, but the words, things like obviously the mention of the word Didcot, mention of the word power station, accident, fatality, immediately, immediately transports me back to the day that happened. And it's bizarre some of the things that you remember from a day like that. I was driving back down the M40. Funnily enough, I'd been fairly close to Didcot on the day that it happened, and I heard on the radio news that there'd been an incident at Didcot. And as I say, having been there, my immediate thought was, "Oh, Didcot." And then they mentioned it was a power station. Well, for those that don't know, there is a Didcot A and a Didcot B. And at the time, the radio news wasn't being specific about which one the incident happened at. But as I say, having been around the project, having seen the demolition taking place firsthand, having seen the company that were doing the work there, at no point during the next hour, 2 hours of my journey home did I even for one moment think, I wonder if that's demolition related. That was like the furthest thought from my mind. Um, I'd seen the professional way that the demolition work was being conducted there, and there was it was just inconceivable. This accident must have been something else in my mind. It was only when I got home, my phone started to ring. um, and again, there are echoes of what's going on in Ohio at the moment. One of the news reports I'm reading was um, somebody who lives near the plant has told the local news that he heard a sound that was similar to that of a train derailing. We had the same with Didcot. It wasn't, although it was, it was very close to a train station. Everybody, I think, at the time, was talking about explosions. Their local people had heard such a loud boom that they swore that it must have been an explosion. And given this was 2016, 15 years after 9/11, and we'd obviously had other terror attacks. I think there was a very real concern that maybe this had been some sort of targeted terror attack. I was certainly asked that when I first arrived on site the day after it happened. But as I say, it quickly became clear that this was a demolition related issue. And it looks rather like we've got that again over in Ohio. You be, not you, I have become painfully aware. I I use words for a living. That's I bring very little else to the party, but I use words for a living. I've been writing about construction and demolition and construction equipment for 30 odd years. Words are the thing that pay my bills and keep the roof over my family's head. Um, but it's at times like this and at times like the immediate aftermath of Didcot that you realise that you haven't got the words that you need. Um, I find myself writing more often than I would like. My thoughts are with the family. I know a lot of people say thoughts and prayers. Well, I don't do prayer. It's a personal thing, but I don't do prayer. My thoughts are with the family. That they are, but what does that even mean? What? There are three families in Ohio now that are dreading a phone call to confirm that their loved one is not going to be coming home. The thoughts of a journalist 5,000 miles away on the other side of the Atlantic mean nothing. Mean nothing at all. So yeah, my thoughts are with them, but my thoughts are with the authorities, I guess, and with the demolition industry as a whole. This is a thing that needs to be resolved. I can sense I'm rambling now, but one of the things that I try to do when I'm interviewing demolition people, you ask them the same question: how do you get into demolition? Blah 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 blah. That if you've read Demolition News, you know the score. If you've read Demolition Magazine, you know the kind of things that we ask. But there's a question that I keep up my sleeve. Not to throw people off, because that's not the sort of interview that I do, but it's a question that sometimes elicits an interesting response. And that question is, if you were king of demolition for a day and you could do anything, just had a magic wand that would allow you to do anything, what would you do? I asked that question. I've never been asked that question. If I were asked that question, it would be to resolve this situation now. I was sent earlier this week details of an incident that had happened with a piling rig on a site in the UK. Nobody was hurt, nobody was killed, but a piling rig here in the UK had tipped over and subsequently been righted. Now, the contractor that was involved in that issued a public statement on the fact that this incident had happened. How refreshing is that? And how alien in demolition is that? Here in demolition, we seem to try our best to pretend that accidents and incidents don't happen. It's not that we turn a blind eye, because that is certainly not the case, but we don't share the details. With Didcot, we're not allowed to share the details because it's all trapped in legal process and so on down the line. But there are learning opportunities that are going to waste. So that would be what I would wave a magic wand at. And that statement from the piling contractor, it achieves so much. For one thing, it shows that they're taking ownership of an incident. As I say, it's a non-fatal incident and nobody was hurt, but they are taking ownership. They are standing up and saying, something went wrong, we're dealing with it. Straight away, that deals with any press speculation. So, even the lowest of the low tabloid press, the Daily Mail, in the face of a statement that says we are dealing with it, can't speculate that they were negligent, or they'd let people down, or they'd put people into harm's way. Straight away, that is nipped in the bud. And more than that, that piling contractor, by sharing that information, has raised a potential concern in the minds of other piling contractors. If that one public statement is then seen by another piling contractor here in the UK, in America, Australia, wherever, and they go to work that day and think, I better be just that little bit more cautious, because I don't want the same thing to happen to me that happened to the piling contractor in the UK. You could potentially save a life with that information. And that's where we are with Didcot, with Ohio. We need these things to be out in the open as quickly and as painlessly as is humanly possible. We shouldn't be talking about a lack of resolution of Didcot 5 years after the incident happened. We shouldn't be sending men and women into the demolition of power stations not armed with all the facts 5 years after a boiler house collapsed during a power station demolition. It just should not be the case. It's a bizarre. As I say, I'm rambling now, but it's like homelessness and child poverty. We're in 2020, heading into 2021. The fact that those things and investigations into accidents are taking so long should not be happening in this day and age. There are odds with everything else that we do. I mentioned earlier on the fact that we have a rolling news media. That rolling news media, for good or for bad, and I kind of blow hot and cold on the subject. In terms of uncovering things, is just so good now. I remember being transfixed by the events of 9/11 and watching that unfold. I mean, literally as it happened. I also remember switching on the TV to watch what was taking place with the attack on the offices of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo a few years ago, and the news media were there. They were revealing the facts there and then. How is it that a in some cases a single journalist and a single cameraman can do that, and yet the combined forces of the health and safety executive of Thames Valley Police and Lord alone knows how many other people have taken 5 years, and we still don't know what happened at Didcot. It blows my mind, and I'm just hoping against hope that when the findings are presented, that there aren't facts within those findings that could have prevented what's happened in Ohio. I don't really have anything else to add. As I said, not entirely sure why I came on. I guess it's become my outlet. There was a time pre-March when my immediate reaction to news was to reach for the keyboard and turn on the screen and start typing. After a year in which we've recorded 200 plus live shows, my inclination now apparently is to switch on the camera and to start rambling. Most of the time when I do that, I enjoy it. I enjoy the interaction with the people that are watching, which you don't get with a printed magazine or even with a website. You tend to throw that sort of news out there and hope against hope that somebody reads it and somebody bothers to respond. Whereas with a live show, you get the feedback immediately, like we've had there from Jason, and I think he's just triggered to tell one of his friends to tune in as well. We get that immediacy, and immediacy is what we need right now. I'm going to sign off in a second. We need immediacy with investigations into accidents and even more so with fatalities. We need immediacy with the rescue and the recovery of workers that are involved in an accident, and we need immediacy in the investigation. It is trite and it is pointless, utterly pointless. But my thoughts are with the families of the three men in Ohio. My thoughts remain with the families of the four men that were killed at the Didcot power station. I hope I'd like nothing more than to be on here later today to say the three men in Ohio have been found safe and well, and that the HSE has presented their findings, and that the families of the guys at Didcot can have a Christmas with some closure. I'm not expecting either of those things to happen, so I've got to go and do my best to write about the Ohio incident. I do appreciate you being here. Is this cathartic? Maybe. It's good to get it off your chest. But one of the things I like about the live stream format is that I can go on for as long or as little as the time takes. Nobody's going to read a 10,000 word article. Certainly not one from me. But they do seem willing to sit here and listen to me ramble on for 45 minutes or however long it's been. So I'm going to let you get on with your day. As I say, my thoughts with the family in Ohio, or the families in Ohio with Didcot. Guys, please stay safe. Look after yourselves, look after your family, your friends, and your loved ones. Take care at work today, and I'll see you again very, very soon in what I hope are more cheerful circumstances. And thanks for watching.